Sirens cut through the stillness of the night, illuminating the old wooden barn, creaking in the cold wind with red and blue flashes. The small town in rural Tennessee seemed frozen in time, but tonight, every street breathed tension. Police officers scurried back and forth, flashlights flickering against the darkness, while hurried orders echoed across the damp, hay-laden field. The people gathered at a distance, unable to believe their eyes. Some held their mouths in shock, others hugged their children tightly, as if to protect them from something invisible. Within that forgotten barn, a secret had been found capable of turning the community upside down. Murmurs spread like wildfire. How was this hidden for so long? How did no one notice before? Spotlights illuminated a newly discovered opening in the ground, a crevice hidden beneath layers of straw. Armed police descended in a line, carrying boxes and evidence that deepened the mystery. From above, the helicopter cast gigantic shadows on the ancient wood, transforming the scene into a disturbing spectacle. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was a silent presence. A boy stood a few feet from the entrance, staring intently, breathing heavily. He wasn't shaking, wasn't crying. His eyes held a weight unbecoming of his 11 years. To him, this wasn't a surprise. It was simply confirmation of something he'd known since the moment he'd stepped into his grandfather's barn. A deep voice broke the silence. If it weren't for that boy, we would never have discovered the truth. And so, amidst sirens and flashes, a name echoed through the night: Isaiah Carter. But how could a simple boy change the fate of an entire city? The answer was hidden long before that night. And if you want to follow how this story unfolds, subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because what comes next is even more surprising. Isaiah Carter was only 11 years old, but he carried in his face a quiet maturity rarely found in children his age. He lived with his mother, Claire, in a small wooden house with a white porch, not far from the city center. His father had disappeared from their lives years ago, leaving a void that was never filled. Claire worked long hours as a server at a local restaurant, so whenever she could, she left Isaiah in the care of his grandfather, Henry, who owned an old ranch and a barn that seemed to stand the test of time. The boy spent entire weekends there, surrounded by horses, chickens, and the distant rumble of a tractor. But unlike the other neighborhood children who ran through the fields and laughed loudly, Isaiah preferred to observe in silence. He had a keen curiosity and a way of looking at things as if deciphering invisible secrets. Adults often mistook his silence for shyness or withdrawal, not realizing that behind those watchful eyes lay a mind that recorded every detail. At school, this trait made him a target of teasing. His classmates mocked his reserved demeanor, and he rarely fought back. He kept the pain of being underestimated to himself, learning to live with the feeling that his voice carried no weight. "Nobody takes you seriously," one of the boys in his class would say, always laughing when Isaiah tried to explain something that seemed strange or unusual. These words were etched like invisible wounds, shaping his desire to prove, one day, that his vision wasn't just imagination. With his grandfather Henry, the relationship was marked by respect and distance. The man, already with white hair and calloused hands, represented a solid but rigid figure to Isaiah. Henry wasn't one for displays of affection. He preferred the silence of the fields and the order of the ranch. Still, there was an invisible thread that connected grandfather and grandson, even if words between them were few. Isaiah felt protected in that place, but also challenged, as if the old barn held not only tools and bales of hay, but secrets that awaited him. One afternoon, sitting on the porch with his grandfather, Isaiah let his gaze wander to the structure of the barn. The dark, weathered boards seemed to whisper stories no one had ever told. He couldn't explain it, but something about that place had always caught his attention. It was as if the barn itself breathed, as if it silently held the echo of voices that no longer existed. As the wind blew and swayed the nearby trees, Isaiah felt an unease creep over his skin. He couldn't have imagined it, but that silent instinct was about to guide him to the discovery that would change his life forever. And it was on one of those seemingly ordinary afternoons that Isaiah noticed something no one else noticed, a muffled sound coming from where there should have been no sound at all. And from that moment on, nothing would be the same. The sun was already sinking behind the hills, tinting the sky orange, when Isaiah, distracted by a piece of old rope dragging along the ground, decided to enter the barn. The place had always evoked a feeling in him that was difficult to explain, a mixture of fascination and dread. The boards creaked with every step, as if echoing secrets kept for decades, and the smell of aged wood mixed with hay created a dense, almost suffocating atmosphere. As he explored the dark corners, Isaiah heard something that sent a chill down his spine, a muffled, metallic sound, as if coming from the ground beneath his feet. At first, he thought it was just the wind passing through the cracks or the rattle of some forgotten tool. But soon he realized there was a rhythm to the knocking, almost as if it was someone calling for help. Heart racing, he pressed his ear to the floorboards and remained silent, trying to catch more of the sound. The knocking suddenly stopped, leaving an even heavier silence in the air. Isaiah took a few steps back, looking around as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Nothing happened. Still, the boy knew, deep in his soul, that it hadn't just been his imagination. At dinner that night, he tried to tell his grandfather what he'd heard. Henry, however, gave a dry laugh and shook his head. "This barn is so old, Isaiah. It creaks everywhere. You need to stop making up stories." The words cut like blades. Isaiah remained silent, but within him grew the feeling that he was onto something important, something no one else noticed. Later, as he lay in bed in the ranch's simple room, the sound echoed in his mind again. Each beat seemed to resonate in the silence of the night, as if someone were trapped beneath the floor. The full moon streamed in through the window, partially illuminating his face, revealing a fixed, restless gaze. He knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he discovered the source of that invisible call. The next morning, with the image still vivid in his mind, Isaiah returned to the barn alone. The cold wind shook the door, which creaked with an almost funereal tone. He took a deep breath, and before he even entered, he sensed the sound would repeat itself again, and it was at that moment, when courage made him approach the center of the barn, that his eyes found something unexpected, a small crevice hidden under the hay that seemed to hide more than anyone imagined. Isaiah entered the barn with slow steps, his heart pounding as if every movement were a warning. The light filtering through the cracks in the boards created golden beams that cut through the gloom, illuminating dust particles floating in the air. The boy looked around, trying to pinpoint the exact source of the sound he'd heard the night before. Then, almost instinctively, he headed for the center, where the hay was scattered unevenly, as if someone had recently disturbed it. Bending down, he pushed aside the dry bundles with his small hands, and it was in that simple gesture that something began to reveal itself. Beneath the thick layer of straw, one of the floorboards seemed loose, unlike the others. The wood was scarred with scratches and had a slight crack that let out a cold breath from beneath. Isaiah's heart raced, and a shiver ran down his spine. Kneeling, he pressed his fingers against the edge of the board and with effort managed to dislodge it. The creak echoed through the barn, deep, as if he had awakened something dormant. Beneath the board lay a wooden trapdoor reinforced with rusty nails, covered in a layer of dust that betrayed its neglect. The boy stood motionless for a few seconds, staring at this discovery as one might stare at a forbidden door. Gathering his courage, he pulled at the iron ring attached to the wood. The low sound of the opening made the entire barn creak. Below, stone steps spiraled down into near total darkness. The air rising from it was cold, damp, and laden with a metallic odor, as if time had stood still in this subterranean cellar. Isaiah took a deep breath, his cell phone flashlight trembling in his hand. He shone it on the first few steps and took 2 steps down, just enough to confirm that this was no ordinary hole. The tunnel looked ancient, built with rough stone walls and stretched away, swallowed by shadow. The boy quickly climbed back up, pulling the lid shut and closing the trapdoor with trembling hands. He remained kneeling for a few minutes, trying to control his breathing. The feeling was clear. That tunnel hadn't been made by chance, and it certainly wasn't known to everyone. Isaiah's mind filled with seemingly unanswerable questions. Who had built it? What was down there? And most importantly, why was the pounding sound echoing from within? Yet despite his fear, something inside him burned with curiosity. He knew he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen it, not after feeling the cold creep up his legs like a breath from the depths. And it was with this mix of fear and curiosity that Isaiah decided to seek help. But when he tried to share his discovery, the world around him didn't react as he expected. Heart still. Racing from the discovery, Isaiah ran to the porch where his grandfather, Henry, rested in his rocking chair, gazing serenely at the horizon. The boy spoke quickly, nearly stumbling over his own words, describing the trapdoor hidden beneath the hay and the tunnel that descended into darkness. His eyes shone with urgency, begging for attention. Henry listened in silence for a few seconds, but then he let out a heavy sigh and shook his head. Isaiah, you've been reading too much into things, making up stories. This barn is over 50 years old. The wood creaks, the wind blows in everywhere. There's nothing down there but dirt and rats. The answer fell like a bucket of cold water. His grandfather, whom he had hoped would be the first to believe, dismissed his revelation as a childish fantasy. Frustrated, Isaiah persisted, begging him to at least check with him, but Henry, with a weary look, raised his hand in a sign of enough. Stop dreaming, kid. There's nothing there. You better not mess with things you shouldn't. The harshness of those words hurt more than any punishment. Isaiah felt small, invisible, as he had so often felt at school. The next day, still restless, he decided to tell his teacher what he'd seen during his break. However, when he described the hidden tunnel, some of his classmates nearby burst out laughing. "Look, the ghost hunter found a magical tunnel," one of them scoffed, imitating exaggerated footsteps. The teacher, patiently, simply smiled and asked Isaiah to focus on his assignments, ignoring what he was saying. The laughter echoed across the courtyard like silent stabs, and Isaiah swallowed hard. No one believed him. No one even considered his words to be true. The feeling of isolation tightened his chest, but alongside it grew something even stronger, the certainty that he could not give up. Back at the ranch that night, Isaiah stared at the moonlit barn. The wind made the door creak softly, as if the place were calling to him. Grandpa's voice echoed in his mind, telling him to forget. But instinct told him otherwise. The tunnel could not be ignored. And it was precisely in that mix of disbelief and loneliness that Isaiah made the riskiest decision of his life: to investigate for himself what lay beneath the barn. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to delve into a secret capable of changing everyone's fate. Night fell over the ranch like a thick blanket, covering every corner with deep shadows. Isaiah waited until he heard the habitual creaking of his grandfather's chair cease, and the silence of the house filled the rooms. Only the insistent ticking of the old wall clock broke the calm. The boy, lying on his makeshift bed in the back room, kept his eyes open. fixed on the wooden ceiling while his mind raced. The image of the trapdoor wouldn't leave his mind, and the muffled sound of knocking seemed to still reverberate within his ears, even amid the absolute silence. With careful movements, he got out of bed. He grabbed the old flashlight that hung on the wall nail and put his cell phone in his pocket, determined to record anything that might prove his discovery. His heart was beating fast, not only from fear, but also from the feeling that he was about to cross an invisible boundary between childhood and something much greater. He crossed the hallway without making a sound, every floorboard protesting beneath his light feet. The front door opened with a soft creak, and the cold night wind enveloped him like an uncomfortable embrace. Outside, the barn loomed in the darkness, its ancient structure silhouetted by the pale moonlight. Isaiah walked toward it with firm steps, but inside he fought the urge to return to the comfort of his bed. Pushing open the barn door, he was greeted by the smell of hay mixed with damp. The flashlight illuminated just what was necessary: piles of straw, leaning tools, shadows that seemed to move with the wind. He approached the spot where he had found the trapdoor, pushed aside the bundles of hay again, and pulled back the wooden lid. The creaking sound echoed through the empty space, as if the place itself resented having its secret revealed. Isaiah took a deep breath before placing his foot on the first stone step. With each step, the darkness seemed to close in around him, swallowing the small light from the flashlight. The humid air carried a metallic, earthy smell, and the feeling of claustrophobia grew as he descended. He didn't know how many steps there were. He just kept descending, listening to the sound of his own heart hammering in his ears. When he finally reached the ground, he realized he was in a narrow tunnel, with stone walls reminiscent of ancient buildings. Dark marks covered some areas, as if time had etched them with stories of pain. Isaiah swallowed hard, raised his phone, and began recording, quietly describing what he saw. The shaky footage showed damp walls, strange markings, and the corridor, stretching beyond the reach of light. Suddenly, he heard the sound again. It wasn't a knocking this time, but something softer, a muffled whisper, almost like a wail coming from within the stone. The boy stopped, holding his breath, and swung the flashlight quickly around. Nothing but darkness and the distant echo of his own breathing. He took a few steps forward and stumbled over something metal. Kneeling down, he found a small iron box partially buried in the ground. The surface was covered in rust, but symbols scratched into it were still visible, symbols that made no sense at first glance. He tried to open it, but it was locked. His cell phone recorded every detail, his trembling voice describing the find as if he were a real investigator. With the box in hand, Isaiah felt a wave of certainty. There was something there that needed to be revealed. The tunnel wasn't just a forgotten passageway, it was a place laden with secrets awaiting watchful eyes like his. And it was precisely at the moment he believed he had taken the first step toward the truth that the pieces began to fall into place. What Isaiah would find next would reveal that this tunnel was connected to something much darker than he could have imagined. Isaiah stood in the tunnel, the sound of his own breathing echoing against the narrow walls. The iron box in his hands seemed to throb with an invisible weight, as if it held memories that should never have been discovered. He carefully placed it on the ground, shining his flashlight around it. It was then that he noticed something even more disturbing. Marks scratched into the stones, almost as if someone had tried to carve desperate messages before disappearing into the darkness. Some letters were illegible, but others formed clearly, names, dates, unfinished sentences that ended in violent scratches. Isaiah's heart raced as he realized these walls weren't just old buildings, but silent records of hidden histories. He photographed every detail with His phone, trying to keep his hands steady even as fear began to freeze his fingers. Up ahead, a pile of damp papers caught his eye. Crouching down, he plucked some of them from the sodden ground. They were old newspaper clippings, yellowed and nearly illegible. The flickering light revealed headlines that made him gasp. Teenager mysteriously disappears in neighboring county. Family cries out for justice after daughter disappears without a trace. Investigations do not indicate any suspects. Each clipping seemed like a forgotten cry from the past, as if someone had collected the evidence of a pain that the city preferred to forget. Isaiah flipped through the pages with wide eyes, and the more he read, the clearer it became that this was no mere coincidence. The tunnel hid more than memories. It was a dark link to disappearances no one had ever solved. The boy's mind filled with questions. Who had gathered this evidence, and why was it there, in the basement of his grandfather's ranch? Suddenly, a metallic clang echoed down the hallway. Isaiah quickly raised his flashlight, illuminating a shadow that disappeared around the corner. A chill ran down his spine, and he instinctively clutched the box to his chest. Someone had been there before. Maybe they still were. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to walk a few more meters, ignoring the fear that grew with each step. The tunnel branched off, and in one of the side passages, he found an object lying on the ground, a small backpack covered in mud and torn in places. Inside was a child's notebook with unfinished drawings, the name Emily scrawled on the cover. Isaiah felt a lump tighten in his throat. Emily was the name of a girl who had disappeared 2 years earlier, a case that had gained attention throughout the region. Kneeling, clutching his backpack, Isaiah understood it wasn't just a family secret or some hiding place. That tunnel was directly linked to the disappearances that haunted the city. The boy didn't know how, but he knew he had to see it through. And it was in that instant, as he put together the pieces of a macabre puzzle, that Isaiah realized the true danger. Because the tunnel wasn't just a place of mystery, it was also a place where someone or something still moved in the shadows. The air in the tunnel seemed heavier, as if every breath was being sucked into the stone walls. Isaiah was moving slowly, the flashlight trembling in his hand, when he heard the metallic sound again. This time it wasn't distant or muffled. It came from close by, so close that his heart nearly leaped from his chest. The flickering light illuminated a narrow, empty corridor, but the feeling that he was being watched wouldn't leave him. He clutched the found backpack, his fingers clutching the torn fabric as if it were a shield against the darkness. The echo of his own footsteps reverberated in the distance, creating the illusion of more people walking with him. The cold intensified, and the humid air clung to his skin like a blanket of ice. Suddenly, a sharp crack shattered the silence. Isaiah swung the flashlight quickly, and for a second, he saw a shadow move against the wall. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't the wind. Someone was there. His breath became shallow, and his knees nearly buckled. He wanted to scream, but instinctively covered his mouth with his hand, muffling any sound that might betray his presence. The boy turned off the flashlight for a moment, letting the darkness swallow him. His heart was pounding so hard, it seemed to betray his position. It was in this absolute darkness that he heard firm, heavy footsteps coming down the same corridor. Each sound against the stone vibrated the air until a low, harsh voice murmured something he couldn't understand. Isaiah huddled against the wall, clutching his cell phone to his chest, praying the intruder would pass by unnoticed. The shadow moved slowly forward, and a faint beam of light, probably from a flashlight, swept across the ground a few feet from where Isaiah was hiding. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if it could render him invisible. The stranger stopped, fell silent, and the tunnel seemed to hold its breath along with the boy. Then, after seconds that seemed eternal, the footsteps resumed and receded down the opposite corridor. Isaiah seized the opportunity and turned on his flashlight again. He knew he didn't have much time. He ran back down the path, his feet stumbling on the loose stones, while the sound of footsteps behind him echoed again, this time faster, as if they'd sensed his escape. The tunnel seemed endless, each turn bringing the feeling that he would be caught. When he finally spotted the stone stairs, relief was instant. He hurried up the steps, nearly falling, and pushed the trapdoor with all his strength. The barn opened before him, illuminated by the pale moonlight streaming through the cracks. Isaiah yanked the lid shut with a bang, falling back onto the hay floor, panting, cold sweat running down his forehead. For a few seconds, he stood still, trying to figure out if his pursuer had caught up with him. But there was no sound, only silence, punctuated by the creaking of the barn door as it swayed in the wind. Still, the sense of danger lingered, as if at any moment the trapdoor might open on its own and reveal whoever was hiding underground. Isaiah clutched his backpack and the rusty box tightly, proof he wasn't imagining anything. Now, more than ever, he knew he had to tell the world what he'd found, but he also understood something terrifying. Whoever was in that tunnel wouldn't allow the truth to come out so easily. And it was with this mixture of fear and urgency that Isaiah made the decision to expose the secret. However, when he finally revealed the evidence, the town's reaction was far beyond anything he could have anticipated. The next morning, Isaiah woke with heavy eyes and hands still shaking. From the night before, his backpack and rusty box were hidden under his bed, like secrets burning against his chest. He knew he could no longer carry this alone. The fear of being discredited lingered, but the memory of the shadow in the tunnel was proof enough that something much bigger was at play. Gathering her courage, she went downstairs and found her grandfather sitting at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper with the same serious expression as always. Isaiah slammed her backpack down on the table, catching Henry's attention. Without a word, she unzipped it and revealed the crumpled newspaper clippings, the sketches in the notebook, and the metal box that seemed even heavier in the daylight. "I didn't make anything up, Grandpa. It's all here." The boy's voice was firm, but with an emotional tone that left no room for doubt. Henry picked up the objects, examining them carefully. At first, his look was one of disbelief, but as he turned the yellowed pages and read the headlines, something inside him shifted. His usual stiffness gave way to an uneasy silence, and for the first time, Isaiah saw fear in his grandfather's eyes. Without a second thought, Henry got up and called the police. A few hours later, patrol cars arrived at the ranch. Armed officers and forensic experts entered the barn, removing hay until they found the trapdoor. The atmosphere grew tense, and soon the entire community began to gather outside, drawn by the sirens and the growing hubbub. Like wildfire, the trapdoor opened before everyone, revealing the stone staircase that descended into the unknown. Lanterns illuminated the walls, revealing carved marks, forgotten objects, and the tunnel that stretched deep into the earth. The shock on the neighbors' faces showed that no one was prepared for this revelation. Reporters' cameras recorded everything, and within minutes, the evidence Isaiah had collected began circulating on local news outlets. The entire town was gripped by a mixture of disbelief and outrage. The boy, who until then had been seen as shy and dreamy, was now at the center of a case that would forever shake the community's tranquility. But the public discovery was only the beginning, because what the police would find further down that tunnel would not only confirm Isaiah's worst fears, but also trigger a desperate operation to save a life that could still be saved. The barn, once a forgotten space on the ranch, became the stage for a cinematic operation. Federal police arrived in dark pickup trucks, while helicopters illuminated the field with powerful spotlights. The whine of the blades mingled with the metallic sound of equipment being unloaded. Isaiah watched from afar, his eyes wide and his heart heavy, knowing that every move those men made was a direct result of their courage. The agents descended the tunnel with high-powered flashlights, ropes, and weapons drawn. Inside, the smell of mold and rust intensified, while cameras streamed live footage to monitors mounted outside. Henry, beside his grandson, remained silent, holding the boy's shoulder firmly, as if to convey reassurance, but also carrying a silent regret for not having listened to him sooner. Minutes that felt like hours passed before a voice came over the radio. "We found something." Tension filled the room. Everyone held their breath. The operation chief ordered silence, and the muffled sound of the communication echoed through the receivers until the most anticipated words emerged. "Someone's here, she's alive." From the tunnel, 4 officers emerged carrying a makeshift stretcher. On it, a teenage girl with tangled hair and frightened eyes blinked against the light after days, maybe weeks, in complete darkness. It was Emily, the missing girl Isaiah knew only from the news. A murmur rose among the crowd gathered outside, cries of astonishment, tears of relief, hands raised to the sky in thanks. Isaiah couldn't contain his emotion. The lump in his throat dissolved into silent tears, and his ragged breath accompanied each step from the stretcher to the ambulance. Henry wrapped his arm around his grandson, holding him close, and whispered, "You saved that girl, Isaiah. I'll never doubt your voice again." While Emily was taken for medical attention, agents returned to the tunnel, collecting additional evidence and sealing the area as a crime scene. The boxes, papers, and objects recovered became key pieces of an investigation that was now gaining national attention. Journalists surrounded the ranch, cameras trained on the barn that had become a symbol of pain, courage, and revelation. But above all, everyone's eyes focused on the 11-year-old boy who dared to believe what no one else wanted to hear. The shy, disbelieving boy was now recognized as a hero, even if his expression still bore the mark of the fear he'd experienced underground. And although the operation had ended with a life saved and a criminal arrested, Isaiah knew deep down that that tunnel still held echoes of undisclosed secrets. And it would be precisely in this moment of relief and public recognition that the deepest wound would come to light. Because, despite justice being served, there was something in Isaiah that still cried out for healing, something that would only be resolved when he was finally truly heard. The morning after the rescue, the small town woke up different. Newspaper headlines featured Emily's face, now saved, and prominently mentioned the name of the boy who had been responsible for changing the course of events, Isaiah Carter, 11 years old. For the community, accustomed to seeing him as the quiet boy who observed everything in silence, it was difficult to believe that such courage had come from him. The school, which had so often been the scene of laughter and teasing, now greeted him with looks of respect and admiration. Classmates who had previously mocked him approached him with shy words. "You were amazing." Isaiah, the teacher, embarrassed, stroked his head and said softly, "I should have listened to you." Each word was like a balm for old wounds, but also brought a pang of pain, because only now did they hear his voice when it was too late to erase the moments he had been ignored. The most profound recognition, however, came from within the home. Henry, the stern and severe grandfather, asked everyone to gather at the ranch that afternoon. In front of neighbors, police, and reporters, he approached his grandson with slow steps, his eyes brimming with tears, and placed a firm hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "I didn't know how to listen to you when I needed you most." The old man's voice trembled, filled with regret. "Today, I know that my grandson is more than brave. He is the reason we are all at peace." Isaiah swallowed, feeling tears stream down his face. He didn't respond with words, just letting his grandfather's strong embrace speak for itself. It was as if, finally, the silence that had always haunted him had been broken, replaced by the certainty that his voice mattered. The police presented him with a symbolic certificate of bravery, and the residents gave him a standing ovation. But Isaiah wasn't seeking medals or the spotlight. What he truly wanted was something much simpler, to be heard from the beginning when no one believed him. And it was in this contrast between belated applause and still open wounds that the story found its most delicate point. Because even after the recognition, a silent unease remained within Isaiah, something that would only be revealed when he returned to the barn days later. The barn was silent when Isaiah returned a few days later. The police operation was over, the floodlights had been removed, and only the wind made the door creak softly, as if trying to recall everything that had happened there. The boy walked slowly, each step echoing on the wooden floor, as if he were treading on recent memories. The hay had been replaced, the trapdoor was sealed, and normalcy seemed to have returned, but Isaiah knew nothing would ever be the same again. He approached the area where he'd found the tunnel and knelt, running his hand over the reinforced planks. The cold touch of the wood sent a shiver down his spine, as if he could still feel the whispers of the darkness that dwelt below. He remained motionless for a few seconds in absolute silence, trying to understand why the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. Emily's rescue had brought justice, but within him was the strange impression that those walls hid more stories that had yet to surface. He stood and walked to the barn's side window. The afternoon light streamed in golden beams, illuminating the dust suspended in the air, creating an almost dreamlike scene. Isaiah rested his hands on the wooden frame and let his gaze wander to the horizon, where the countryside stretched as far as the eye could see. At that moment, his eyes seemed to carry not only the memory of everything he had experienced, but also the awareness that, young as he was, he had changed the destiny of an entire town. Suddenly, a detail caught his attention. On the wood near the window, there was a new scratch, a mark that hadn't been there before. It wasn't large, just a jagged line, but enough to make him hold his breath. He ran his fingers over the notch, and for a moment, he felt he wasn't alone. The question hung in the air. Had the tunnel truly been closed, or were there still more secrets waiting to be discovered? Isaiah had no answer, but he knew his life would never be the same. He was just a boy, but now he carried the weight of courage and the certainty that when everyone refuses to listen, you must persist. The silence that once isolated him was now the mark of someone who saw beyond. If this story touched you and sparked your curiosity about what might still be hidden in ordinary places, subscribe to the channel now. There are many moving stories of courage and mystery waiting for you here. Turn on notifications, share this video, and stay with us to discover stories that prove that even a simple gesture can change the fate of many.